The Sealed Succession File. This is a work of fiction. All characters, titles, and events are entirely invented and do not depict any real person, monarchy, or nation. For 3 decades, the Kingdom of Aldmere had known only one queen consort, Adeliisa, wife of King Edmund IV. She had come into the royal family as a widow with a complicated past, and the public had taken more than 15 years to fully embrace her. But embrace her they eventually did. By the time Edmund's health began to fail, Adeliisa was no longer seen as the outsider who had once scandalized the court. She was simply the queen. What almost nobody in the kingdom knew, not the newspapers, not the household staff, not even most of the Privy Council, was that a single document, quietly filed 3 years earlier, would decide everything about what happened to her once Edmund was gone. And on a gray autumn evening, inside a private study in Aldmere Castle that the public would never see, that document was finally opened in front of her. The meeting had been arranged without fanfare. No court circular mentioned it. No car arrived with flags. Crown Prince Aldric and his wife, Crown Princess Wren, entered through a side corridor, usually reserved for household staff, specifically so that no one would note the hour or the gathering. King Edmund and Queen Adeliisa were already seated when the couple arrived. Between them, on a long oak table polished by generations of use, sat a single leather folder stamped with the royal seal of succession. It had been prepared not by Aldric and not by Wren, but by the Privy Council's Constitutional Office, the quiet arm of the palace that existed to answer one question and one question only: what happens to power when a reign ends? Aldric took his seat first. Wren followed, settling beside him with the composure that had made her, over the years, one of the most trusted figures in Aldmere. Trusted not because she sought attention, but because she rarely offered an opinion she hadn't already thought through twice. A senior constitutional advisor, a woman named Director Halsworth, who had served 3 reigns, opened the folder and began to read aloud. The first clause was simple enough that even a child could understand it. Queen Adeliisa would remain queen consort for the remainder of King Edmund's reign. That much had never been in dispute. It was the second clause that changed the temperature of the room. Upon the conclusion of Edmund's reign, all titles, household authority, and ceremonial precedence currently held by the queen consort would lapse. There would be no automatic continuation into the reign of King Aldric. Adeliisa's hands, folded in her lap, tightened almost imperceptibly. It was Aldric who spoke first, and he did so with the same measured calm his father had once been known for, before illness had worn it thin. He said that the crown could not carry 2 centers of authority into a new reign, one that governed and one that lingered from the reign before it. There had to be a single, unambiguous line of command, and no queen consort, however admired, could occupy a permanent place above that principle. Wren said nothing at first, but her presence beside her husband was its own statement, and Adeliisa understood it immediately. This was not Aldric acting alone against a woman he had never fully warmed to. This was the future king and the future queen, arriving at the same conclusion together. Director Halsworth turned the page. What followed was a list, 5 separate requests that had originated over the previous 18 months from Adeliisa's private office. Continued staffing for her household after Edmund's reign. A formal advisory role in appointments to 2 royal charitable trusts. Preserved access to Ashcombe Lodge, a residence technically owned by the crown rather than by Adeliisa personally. Ongoing state-funded security for her adult children from a previous marriage. And a clause allowing her office to retain a seat, though non-voting, on the Household Appointments Board. Individually, each request could be defended. Together, they read like the blueprint for a second royal court, one that would persist quietly alongside Aldric's, drawing on state resources without answering to the new reign at all. Edmund glanced toward his son, as if hoping Aldric might soften. He did not. It was Wren who leaned forward next, and what she said landed harder than anything Aldric had spoken. A royal title, she said, was never meant to be personal property. It existed to represent service to the crown, to the public, to the institution itself. It could not be quietly converted into a lifetime allowance for people who, however sympathetic their circumstances, held no ongoing constitutional duty. Adeliisa's composure did not break, but something behind her eyes did. She had spent years absorbing public criticism that Edmund's first wife had never faced in quite the same way. She had waited a long time to be accepted, and now in this quiet room, she was being told that the acceptance she'd fought for had an expiration date built into it from the start. She turned to Edmund, searching his face for the reassurance she had always assumed would be there. He did not meet her eyes. Wren opened a second, thinner folder that had been resting beneath the first. Inside was a memorandum, a summary of an earlier private meeting, held nearly a year prior, between Adelice's household office and the same constitutional advisors now sitting across the table. In that meeting, the advisors had stated plainly that consort privileges could not automatically extend beyond the reign in which they were granted. Edmund finally asked the question that had clearly been sitting beneath everything else. Was this punishment? Aldrich answered without hesitation. No, it was structure. He explained that this was never about diminishing what Adelice had done, the charity work, the public appearances, the years of standing beside a king through difficult scrutiny. It was about preventing exactly the kind of overlapping, unclear authority that had damaged royal households in other kingdoms, staff loyal to two different offices, family members expecting privileges nobody could quite justify, a new reign spending its first year untangling promises made in the reign before it. Wren turned to the final section of the appendix, where the legal foundation for the entire policy was laid out. It had not been written by her, and it had not originated with Aldrich. It came from a reform passed 2 years earlier, a reform meant to link royal titles, funded residences, and household staffing directly to active constitutional duty, and to prevent the crown's household from quietly expanding beyond what any single reign required. The reform bore Edmund's own signature. He stared at it for a long moment, as though trying to remember signing something that now seemed to be working against the person he most wanted to protect. Wren said, gently but without retreat, that Aldrich was not inventing a new rule to use against Adelice. He was simply applying a rule the king himself had already approved. If Edmund tried now to carve out an exception for his own wife, he would be conceding that the reform applied to everyone in the kingdom except the one person closest to him. The door opened without ceremony, and Aldrich's aunt, Princess Royal Beatrix, stepped into the room. She had been asked to review the succession file for a simple reason. She had served under 2 different monarchs and understood, better than almost anyone alive, how quickly an unclear line of authority could unravel a household from the inside. She did not raise her voice. She reminded Edmund plainly that a reform only has meaning if the person who signs it is also willing to live under it. A king could not ask the wider family to accept smaller households, reduce staff, and stricter accountability, only to quietly exempt his own wife the moment the rule became personally inconvenient. Adelice accused Beatrix of simply taking Aldrich's side. Beatrix did not deny standing with him, but she rejected the idea that this was about sides at all. The real issue, she said, was structural rather than personal. One office belonged to the current reign. Another would soon belong to the next one. Blurring the line between them would leave staff, advisors, and even extended family uncertain about whose instructions actually carried weight. It rarely announced itself with a public scandal. It arrived quietly, one disputed appointment, one household insisting an old arrangement was still valid, one advisor unsure which office to answer to. Wren added a further, practical concern. If Adelice retained functional status equivalent to a queen after Edmund's reign, where would that leave Wren herself, the actual queen of the new era? Who would take precedence at state functions? Whose household staff would oversee royal appointments? Which office would greet visiting dignitaries first? A kingdom, she said, could not run 2 queens in parallel, regardless of how much affection or history stood behind the one who was stepping back. Adelice suggested that Wren's objections were simply self-interested, a future queen securing her own position. Wren did not deny it, but she didn't accept the framing either. Protecting clarity for the next reign, she said, was not competition. It was responsibility. Supporting Edmund loyally through his reign had been Adelice's role. Ensuring the next reign began without confusion was now Wren's. Director Halsworth delivered the final, unavoidable fact. The policy was already legally finalized. It had been recorded in the official succession file months earlier, reviewed by the full constitutional office, and closed. Edmund could object. He could request a fresh review. But he could not erase a decision that had already become part of the kingdom's formal record. Adelice pushed the folder back across the table and asked Edmund, directly, to overturn it before anyone outside the room learned what had been decided. For the first time all evening, Aldrich answered instead of his father. He told her, without cruelty but without hesitation, that Edmund could delay the process or lodge a formal protest, but he no longer held the power to make the decision quietly vanish. It had already become part of the plan for the future. She stopped looking at Edmund. She looked instead at Aldrich, and for a moment the room lost all its papers and formality. The question she asked was simple and entirely personal. Did he truly intend to take this from her? Aldrich answered that it was not about how he felt toward her. It was about whether the next reign began on solid ground or an unstable one. The decision was already made. His duty now was to carry it forward, not to pretend it hadn't happened. Edmund rose and walked slowly to the window, looking out over gardens he had known his entire life. For years, he had shielded Adelisa from public criticism, private disapproval, and the long shadow of a marriage that had come before hers. Now the most serious challenge to her future was not coming from outside the palace walls. It was coming from his own son. He offered one last compromise. Adelisa could retain a ceremonial title after his reign, along with a smaller household and continued public recognition, even without formal authority. For a moment, the room seemed to soften. Aldrich declined the compromise. Even a ceremonial title, he explained, carried real weight if people around it continued acting as though nothing had changed. Staff followed titles. Officials extended deference based on rank, regardless of whether real authority sat behind it. A title meant to be symbolic could quietly regain influence simply because everyone continued treating it as though it still had teeth. Wren offered a narrower alternative instead. Adelisa would receive genuine private respect, continued security appropriate to her circumstances, and a stable home for the rest of her life. What she would not retain was authority, no control over appointments, no instructions given to household staff, no formal role in the new reign's constitutional structure. Before Adelisa could respond, the press secretary entered with a draft public statement. It mentioned no disagreement, no confrontation, no names beyond a simple constitutional clarification about how the royal household would be structured going forward. The kingdom would never see this room, this table, or this conversation. Edmund asked finally where he needed to sign. Director Halsworth told him gently that no further signature was required. He had already authorized the underlying reform months before, and the file had since been formally closed. Aldrich and Wren were not seeking his approval tonight. They were simply confirming that the rules he himself had already set in motion would now be followed. Something in Adelisa's understanding of the evening shifted completely. She had believed, walking in, that Edmund still held one final power capable of protecting her. She now understood that he had already surrendered it, perhaps without fully realizing what he was signing at the time. The final page was placed in front of her. Near the bottom sat Edmund's own initials beside the original approval of the reform, his handwriting unmistakable, dated more than 2 years earlier. She lifted her eyes slowly from the page to the man standing at the window, and in that light he looked less like a king and more like a husband confronting a truth he hadn't seen coming. She reached out and touched the initials with one finger. No one in the room spoke. Not Aldrich. Not Wren. Not Beatrix. She asked Edmund quietly whether he had known. Before he could answer, Director Halsworth closed the folder and set down one more, smaller and sealed, that no one had mentioned until now. The name on the front was Wren's. She had not written whatever was inside herself. It was instead a private memorandum prepared after a separate meeting she had once attended with the Constitutional Office, a meeting held long before tonight, when the shape of the next reign was still being quietly drawn. What it contained would have to wait for another evening.